Hello, my name is Martha Lagasse, and I am a student in the Linguistics Department, as well as the Honors College here at UCA. And today, we're going to be taking a look at the framing of gender in survey research. Now, before we get into things, I'd first like to ask you to think back to the last time you took a survey or filled out a form. Maybe it was something for school, or maybe it was just something you found on the back of a receipt somewhere. Regardless, and whatever it was, odds are you have to answer a question that looked a lot like this one here on the screen. And it seems pretty simple and inconspicuous. However, there have actually been numerous critiques directed towards questions written just like this one here. One critique is that it conflates sex and gender, or it's not really clear about what's being asked about. In case you weren't aware, sex in this case refers to a characteristic that is determined or assigned at birth based on physical or biological characteristics, while gender is more about how someone identifies. Another critique is that it doesn't allow transgender respondents to identify themselves, or for researchers to distinguish between transgender and cisgender respondents. Transgender people are those whose gender identity doesn't align, so to speak, with their sex assigned at birth. That's not the case for cisgender people, whose gender and sex do match up. So, a transgender or trans man will be someone whose gender identity is a man, but whose sex assigned at birth was female. A cisgender or cis man, meanwhile, is someone who identifies as a man and whose sex assigned at birth was male. And you can say similarly for transgender and cisgender women. Another critique of that question is that it excluded non-binary people. People who are non-binary have gender identities which, as the name implies, don't fall into the male-female binary. Since they also have a gender identity that is different from their sex assigned at birth, they are transgender. Though non-binary people often simply just say they're non-binary, in order to be more specific and to avoid being confused with binary trans people, aka transgender men and transgender women. And what these sorts of issues mean is that we end up missing out on a lot of important, valuable data about these marginalized minority communities, which in turn is going to limit any efforts we might make to better understand or support them. These issues also mean that whatever data we do collect is going to end up being muddied and mixed up, which is not desirable for research purposes. Now, my research is focused a lot on looking at approved methods for asking these sorts of questions, but today I want to highlight and emphasize the fact that just giving researchers improved methods to use isn't always going to be enough. We have to be careful to avoid misunderstandings and realize that there are deeper underlying assumptions which drive these issues in the first place. And what I mean by deeper assumptions is that when we ask questions about certain categories, we're going to do so in a way that reflects how we ourselves understand those categories. For example, if we ask, "What is your gender/sex?" and offer only male and female as response options, we put forth a certain framework of what gender and sex are. 1, they are the same thing, and 2, there are only 2 options. Oftentimes, we don't even realize what we're doing. We just simply take our own conceptions for granted. And that can be a real problem when survey designers and survey respondents view these categories in different ways. This sort of issue of framing and how it determines things and can create conflict happens in all sorts of other contexts. Patricia Hill Collins, for example, discusses something similar in her book, Black Feminist Thought, particularly in regards to how epistemic framing determines what gets to count as real knowledge, whose experiences are valid, specifically how traditional framing of knowledge has excluded Black women's knowledge and experiences. And so what all of this ends up meaning is that even if researchers realize there's a problem when they listen to feedback from marginalized groups, if they just aim for a quick fix by adding a few new options and not truly examining what's there in the first place, then any efforts to improve are going to inevitably fall short. Now, this comes from a 2016 article published in Psychology Today by a market researcher who wanted to improve how he asked about gender in his research. And what he did was look at existing research on just that topic. Specifically, he looked at something called the two-step method. Now, the two-step method asks about both sex assigned at birth and gender identity in 2 questions, hence the name two-step method. The point of this is so that researchers can compare response answers to both these questions in order to distinguish between transgender and cisgender respondents. Now, what the author of this article took away was, well, I don't really need to know about sex in my research, so I'll just ask about gender and modify things a bit by adding in transgender and other options. And the researcher ended up giving this question right here as a suggestion for others. Now, what this does is miss the point of the two-step method. The two-step method doesn't ask about respondent's sex for no reason. It's so that researchers can compare it with the answers to the gender question in order to distinguish between trans and cis respondents. Taking out one of those questions renders that purpose not possible. You might as well have not started from the two-step method in the first place if you're just going to make it a one-step method. And the options he adds to apparently account for this change create additional problems. To be clear, transgender is not a gender identity unto itself. It is a word that, like cisgender, which is not listed here, merely describes whether or how someone's sex assigned at birth and gender identity compare. But here, transgender is cast as a category which is exclusive of male and female. You can either select or identify as transgender, or you can identify as male or female. This categorization contrasts with statements you might have heard before, like trans women are women and trans men are men, where trans people are explicitly acknowledged to be part of those gender categories. After all, you don't hear it as trans woman and woman, or trans men and men. You can also think of it compared to the implication of statements such as, those are my friends and Carl. The implication there is that Carl is not part of that friend group. Similarly, if you say transgender people and men, or transgender people and women, or transgender people and men and women, the implication is that trans people aren't men and women. So how is a transgender person supposed to respond to this sort of question? They aren't allowed to be both trans and a man or trans and a woman. They can only be one. Now, the addition of the other option is presumably for non-binary people. And having the option for response to self-describe is a good thing, but being labeled as other can be othering. It can make someone feel alien or lesser than. So, just acknowledging the simple fact that more than 2 binary options exist isn't enough. And there's real potential for misunderstandings because our underlying frames can get in the way when we view these issues. Now, you might think, well, this is from a single researcher in 2016. That was 5 years ago. Times have changed. And while, yes, there's certainly been general improvement, those deeper frameworks very much still come into play, even from very prominent institutions. Such as Pew Research Center, which released an article in September of 2020 detailing research they have conducted testing new ways to ask about gender in their surveys. Now, that's a great thing, but there are definitely some oddities and flaws present in this article. For instance, the following is how the article defines what it means to be transgender. People who identify as neither a man nor a woman. Sometimes people in this group use the term non-binary. Or those who identify with a gender different from the sex they were assigned at birth. Now, this definition is technically correct, but the way it's laid out is odd. And a big part of that is because the part of the definition that they list second is actually what's typically seen as the primary definition of the term transgender. Now, as we went over earlier, non-binary people are trans, and that's because they identify with a gender different from the sex they were assigned at birth, like the definition says. They fall into that part. So why are they separated out from that and listed first? Putting non-binary as the first part of the definition for transgender implies that that is the primary meaning of the term, when it's really more of a specific type. I mean, there's also binary trans people who identify as men and women. So what this definition does is sort of portray a framework where transgender people are primarily separate from the categories of men and women. And we'll see the potential effects of that later in this presentation. Now, the meat of this article is that they tested a version of the two-step method, which you can see here. 1, were you born male or female? And 2, do you describe yourself as a man, a woman, or in some other way? Now, there are some concerns with just the wording of the question itself. In particular, the use of the phrase born as is rather odd here, since we don't ever really find research on the two-step method that uses that particular wording. What you'll find is something more like, what sex were you assigned at birth? Since, as this very article notes, sex is a biological construct assigned at birth, and the wording in that question makes that fact more clear. And in fact, they mentioned towards the end of the article that a small number of respondents actually expressed some concern over this wording. Also, at the end, they essentially do the same thing that the author of that 2016 article did that we looked at earlier, particularly when it comes to misunderstanding the point of the two-step method. When explaining why they will only ask about gender and not sex in their surveys in the future, they state, the inclusion of a question about respondent sex is necessary for most of the center's research, which focuses predominantly on gender. And while we do construct weights based on population estimates by sex, the correlation between gender and sex suggests that gender can reliably be used as a proxy for sex for this purpose. For the first sentence, again, the point of the two-step method is misunderstood. A respondent's sex is not asked about for its own sake. It's so that researchers can use it alongside the gender question to distinguish between transgender and cisgender respondents. As for the second sentence, the correlation between gender and sex happens for cisgender respondents. In cases where there isn't correlation, that's with transgender respondents. Again, the whole point of the two-step method. The fact that most of the survey respondents were cisgender, and most people are cisgender, is by no means surprising or new information. Instead, what this statement ends up saying, when you take it in combination with the fact that it's used to explain why the two-step method will no longer be used, is that since most respondents aren't transgender, since transgender people are a minority, identifying them is not important. And that's not necessarily good research ethics. And I am practically certain that the authors of this piece did not intend to imply this sort of meaning in any way whatsoever. And again, similar to that 2016 article, there's this framework where transgender people are not part of basic categories like men and women. While this doesn't come up in the question themselves this time, it does manifest in the chart detailing how the researchers interpret the results, which you can see on the screen here. Both how we ask the questions and how we interpret the answers reflect our mental frameworks. Basic categories like men and women are assumed to be inherently cisgender here. Cisgender people are not separated out from these categories, but transgender people are. Binary transgender respondents are separated from the categories of men and women, just the same as non-binary transgender respondents are, conflating the two groups. It's possible this ties back to what we observed earlier and how the article defined the term transgender in the first place, viewing transgender people as primarily separate from these categories. And again, it's important to note the different frameworks for viewing these categories do exist. Research has shown this. This quote comes from the findings of a study conducted in 2019. comparing how different groups, including transgender people, cisgender heterosexual people, and cisgender people with minority sexualities, define terms like male, female, man, woman, masculine, and feminine. So, for example, a lot of research uses terms like male and female interchangeably with man and woman. But that has variation in how it's perceived, and complexity can also vary. Transgender populations tend to view these categories in more complex ways than cisgender populations do. As for further implications, if you'll think back to how the Pew article used the two-step method, it distinguishes sex and gender questions by using male and female in one and man and woman in the other, without actually using the terms gender or sex and explaining the difference between the two. It's just assumed by the terminology. But it's possible that only relying on the differing terminology might actually confuse certain respondents who could view those terms to mean the same things. It's important that researchers account for variation in how people view these categories. Now, having said all of that and having gone over all of those examples, what's the best practice? Well, we have to realize that it's going to be impossible for the conceptions which survey designers operate on to match up with every single person who might answer their questions. And on top of that, these conceptions are likely going to change across time and across social location. So the best practice is going to be to ask questions with frameworks that are as inclusive as we can make them, and to be clear and understandable in how we present them, or at least as clear and understandable as we can possibly be. The University of Central Arkansas, for instance, has recently revised how it asks about gender identity in the admissions process. Basic categories like male or female aren't assumed to be inherently cisgender, and the difference between cisgender and transgender is clearly explained. There are also now response options for people with identities like nonbinary, or genderqueer, or gender fluid. And I think there's been lots of improvement. There's still some ways to go, but it's been working within the system that the university has to work with. And having these improvements and examining these frameworks is really, really important for avoiding response error, which this area is ripe for. After all, researchers can't expect these respondents to all make the same calls. As sociologist Laura Carpenter notes in a piece discussing the importance of researchers recognizing the ambiguity of virginity loss, response error can result from insufficient knowledge or communication issues, such as in cases when study participants and researchers interpret particular words and phrases in different ways. Researchers themselves aren't immune to misunderstandings and miscommunication, just the same as respondents. And when we ask flawed, inaccurate questions, we're going to end up getting flawed, inaccurate data. And that's in no way desirable for research, as mentioned towards the beginning of this presentation. And these sorts of issues also apply much more broadly to all sorts of different demographic questions and issues of identification. When it comes down to it, we have to remember that inclusion and accuracy are both at stake here. When a trans man is given options like man and transgender, what is he supposed to do? Other himself from his gender? When a trans woman is given options like woman and transgender woman, what is she supposed to do? Say she's not also simply a woman? Is that fair? Or what about non-binary individuals? Their mere existences often aren't even acknowledged at all in these sorts of surveys and forums. And these sorts of questions about who gets to be simply a woman or a man go beyond just the sort of straightforward categorization you see in survey research. The recent surge of anti-trans legislation has made this fact very clear, but so does the way this legislation is discussed by others. whether it be just in general conversation or in the media. In the future, perhaps we can all make a more conscious effort to consider just how often simply woman is used in contrast to transgender woman, or just men in contrast to transgender men. Maybe this sort of thinking could engender greater understanding of gender and how we view it. Here on the screen, you'll see my references that I used for this presentation, if anyone's interested in seeing where I drew my information from. And thank you. This has been my presentation, and I hope it offered something useful.